What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
They told me since I was a kid, we're saving for your future. I grew up believing in that promise the way some kids believe in Santa Claus, blindly, completely, never questioning that the people who brought me into the world would protect me when the time came. Turns out, the only future they were saving for was my brother's. Law school for him, lies for me. That was the night I stopped being their daughter and started being my own damn parent. When I walked across the stage to collect my high school diploma, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement, but beneath all of that there was this steady calm because I thought my next step was secure. My parents had repeated the same line for years, "Don't worry, we've got a college fund for you." I had pictured it countless times, a tidy savings account sitting there waiting, built off every Christmas they skipped fancy presents and every vacation they said we couldn't afford. I thought I was being handed not just a diploma that day, but also the key to a door that had been quietly waiting for me all along. That night, we sat at the kitchen table, the same chipped table where I had once spread crayons and coloring books, now cluttered with graduation cards. My mom smiled thinly, my dad cleared his throat, and I knew something was off because neither of them looked proud so much as nervous. They exchanged glances like people about to confess something ugly. Finally, my dad muttered that things weren't as straightforward as I might think, and my mom jumped in to soften the blow, saying money was tighter than expected and that unfortunately, there wasn't really a fund after all. They told me I'd have to take out loans if I wanted to go anywhere beyond community college. I sat there frozen, my tassels still hanging around my neck like a cruel joke. At first, I thought they meant something had gone wrong recently, like maybe an emergency drained the savings, some medical bill, or sudden disaster. But then my mom, with this fake sympathetic tilt of her head, added that I'd just have to be realistic because college is expensive for everyone. It was the way she said everyone that made my stomach twist because it wasn't true. Not in our house. A week later, while putting away laundry in the den, I overheard my brother David on the phone with one of his friends. He was laughing, bragging about how mom and dad had covered his law school tuition, saying he didn't even have to touch his own savings. I nearly dropped the pile of shirts in my hands. My first instinct was denial, that maybe I misheard or that it was some kind of misunderstanding. But the more he talked, the clearer it became. They had paid everything for him, every cent, while letting me sit there like a fool thinking I was broke and on my own. I didn't confront them immediately. Instead, I started looking for evidence, because a part of me still clung to the possibility that this wasn't real, that maybe he had exaggerated or that his loans were quietly in his own name. But one evening, while helping my dad with some paperwork he left scattered across the dining room, I saw the truth in black and white. Tuition receipts, checks signed from their joint account, payment plans, all with my brother's name neatly printed on them. No mention of me. Not a single document with my future on it. I remember my breath catching in my throat, my hands shaking as I slid the paper back into the stack like nothing had happened. I wanted to scream, to shove it in their faces and demand answers, but some deeper instinct told me not to. Instead, I smiled through dinner that night, nodding politely at whatever story they were telling, while my brain spun with the new reality. They hadn't just failed to save for me, they had deliberately chosen to save for him, and then lied to my face for years about it. Every memory of them telling me to study hard because it would pay off when the time comes suddenly felt poisonous, like they had been patting me on the head while secretly planning to pull the rug out from under me. I thought back to every time I had asked if we could visit a college campus, and they'd said, later, "No rush, you'll get your chance." Turns out the only tours they had planned were for David. That night, alone in my room, I stared at the ceiling and realized something fundamental had broken. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about years of believing that no matter how imperfect our family was, we were at least fair. And now I knew fairness had never been part of the equation. I wanted to tell myself I'd just move on, find a way to forgive, but another thought crept in stronger and sharper. If they could lie about this, what else had they lied about? And more importantly, how could I ever trust them again when every word might be another carefully polished betrayal? I didn't have answers yet, but I knew one thing. I would never ask them for $1, and I would never give them another ounce of blind loyalty. What they had stolen from me wasn't just tuition, it was the illusion that I mattered as much as my brother. And once that illusion shattered, something cold and steady took its place. The next morning, as I poured myself coffee and listened to them chatter about David's upcoming summer classes, I felt something almost calm rise inside me. Let them think I was still the gullible daughter who would nod along. Let them think I was helpless without their so-called support. They had no idea I had just stepped into a new role, quiet, calculating, patient. Because if they thought they could rob me of my future and walk away smiling, they were about to learn that they'd raised someone who knew how to smile right back while planning her own payback. And the first move was already forming in my mind. I decided that silence would be my armor and that politeness would be my camouflage, so I brushed my hair into the same tidy ponytail my mother liked. I offered to do the grocery run and the laundry. And I asked harmless questions about coupons and fabric softener while mapping out the exits in my head like someone learning a building's fire routes. Because the more I smiled and nodded, the more they relaxed into the old rhythm where I was useful and quiet and easy to overlook, and in that comfort they forgot I had eyes and ears and a memory like wet cement hardening around every careless word. I took a part-time job at a cafe where the tips felt like tiny votes that strangers were willing to put in my pocket, and I picked up a second gig doing evening data entry for a small contractor who loved that I never missed a deadline. And between the two, I started stacking pay stubs like playing cards until the pile felt substantial enough to lean on, while at home my parents continued their gentle chorus about being realistic and responsible, which somehow always translated into me cooking dinner and vacuuming the hall and babysitting financial worries that never seemed to knock on my brother's door. David breezed in and out with the careless confidence of someone who knew that a safety net had been woven for him long before he learned to walk, and at dinner he held court about torts and casebooks and the brutal hours that proved his dedication. While my mother topped off his glass and my father nodded like a proud foreman watching a cathedral rise, and when I said little and ate slowly, they took it as a sign that I understood my place, which was convenient for everyone because it meant nobody had to say out loud that one child's ambition had priority and the other's was a hobby to be balanced around chores. In that soft dimness where family assumptions live, I started making meticulous lists that I folded into my wallet. Banks with first-year bonuses for new accounts, community scholarships that did not require parental tax documents, state grants tied to work hours, quiet colleges that admitted in the spring for fall with rolling aid if you supplied clean transcripts and a persuasive letter. And when the house was empty, I sat at the old desktop and filed a tax return that my parents assumed they would handle. Only I removed my dependency claim with a simple, legal checkbox, which meant the small refund they had quietly counted on each year would arrive addressed to me, and by the time they noticed, the check had already been deposited and split, half into an emergency fund, half into a new account with my name alone. I told myself that this was not vengeance so much as course correction. Yet when my mother asked in April if I had seen a letter from the Treasury, and I said with gentle confusion that I had filed independently because I was working and paying my own expenses, the silence that fell across the kitchen was sharp and bright like a dropped plate, and my father cleared his throat and said he wished I had consulted them since these things can get complicated, while I smiled and said I had read the instructions carefully and kept the confirmation emails for my records, which is the kind of sentence that sounds meek until you understand that it is a locked door with the key removed. The weeks that followed tasted like penny metal, equal parts fear and freedom. Because while my savings grew, so did the tension, and my mother began leaving little notes on the counter with lists of tasks: pick up dry cleaning, call Aunt Linda, schedule dentist, underlining them as if ink could turn errands into duty, and I did them without comment, which made me look obedient and made her believe the budgetary discomfort of my tax decision was a temporary glitch rather than a shift in gravity. And in that misreading, my plan had room to breathe. On a rainy Thursday, with the cafe closed early for a plumbing issue and the contractor's files already sorted, I sat in the public library and finalized the ugliest part of the truth I had been dancing around. Because pretending to accept their version of my future would never make it mine, so I wrote a letter that was not poetic or dramatic, but stubbornly practical. outlining my academic interests, my work history, and my need for merit aid. Then I attached the transcripts I had requested, without mentioning it at dinner, and I clicked submit to 3 universities that were in-state yet far enough that a casual drop-in would require planning, a tank of gas, and the willingness to face me sober. The acceptance arrived first by email, and then by a thick envelope that I intercepted from the mailbox with hands that looked steadier than I felt, and I took it to my room and read every line twice, tracing the modest scholarship number with my finger the way some people trace a scar to remind themselves of what healed, and then I tucked it into a folder with my other documents, because gloating would have been emotional and I needed to stay practical if I wanted the finish line to look like independence rather than a loud scene that ended with slammed doors and promises nobody intended to keep. My first true revenge was smaller than the explosion I had fantasized about, but cleaner and more permanent. By separating my finances, by filing as independent, by opening my own accounts and routing every drip of income into channels they could not see, I had cut the invisible wires they loved to tug whenever they needed me to jump. And the best part was that they still thought I was standing by the outlet waiting for instructions. That night, while David lectured us about a professor who allegedly could make or break a legal career with a single recommendation, I laughed at his story at exactly the right moment, and when my mother asked me to bring out the dessert, I did so with the same polite smile she had trained into me, all while the acceptance letter rested behind my dresser like a secret passport. And as I slid the pie onto the table, I realized that the next step would require a move so quiet it would be mistaken for hesitation, a choice that would bruise their pride far more than a screaming match ever could, because it would make them ask whether they had misread me for years or whether I had simply grown into someone they could no longer predict. And when my phone buzzed in my apron pocket with a new message from the university about orientation dates and housing deposits due by late summer, I pressed the screen to silence and kept my eyes on the plates, thinking that timing would be everything. Because once I placed my own down payment on a future they refused to recognize, the conversation at this table would change in a way none of us could undo. I picked a Saturday that looked harmless on the calendar, one of those mild afternoons when relatives drift in carrying salads and gossip, and the whole house hums with the low electrical sound of family performance. Because if I was going to redraw the map of our loyalties, I wanted witnesses who knew the old borders by heart, so I offered to arrive early and set the table and fold the napkins into the little triangles my mother loved. And while I arranged cutlery with obedient precision, I also slid my acceptance folder into the lining of my tote where it lay like a quiet engine warming up, waiting for the moment when the car door would finally open. When the cousins filtered in and the aunts kissed my cheeks and the uncles performed their ritual questions about work and plans, I kept my voice even and cheerful and carefully nondescript, answering in a way that neither bragged nor complained. And I watched my mother glow in the reflected light of my brother's monologues about moot court and externships and summer placements, while my father stood beside him like a lighthouse, steady and bright and very pleased with his own illumination. And in the corner of the room, I felt the faint pull of that old desire to be recognized, which I tamped down because the recognition I wanted now had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with truth. Over dinner, the conversation drifted toward education, an easy current that always seems to carry families to the same shallow waters where they trade platitudes about hard work and fairness, and that was the moment I asked Aunt Linda, who never met a budget she did not interrogate, whether her youngest had decided between the state school with the generous aid or the private one with the glossy brochures, and when she laughed that money talks and brochures whisper, I said that was the most honest thing I had heard at this table in years, which made the cousins snicker and the aunts tilt their heads and my mother tighten her smile the same way she tightens the sheets when she is angry at the bed for wrinkling. I let a beat pass, long enough for curiosity to lift its head. Then I said that I had learned a useful lesson about the difference between promises and payments, because one can be repeated every birthday and the other shows up on a statement with dates and amounts and a routing number, and I saw my father's posture shift the way a guard shifts when he realizes the gate he trusted has a hinge he never checked. And I kept going in a voice as mild as tap water, explaining how incredible it had been to discover that tuition can be fully covered if the right people decide a future is worth underwriting. And how surprising it is when those right people happen to be the same parents who once used the phrase, "We have a college fund for you," with the casual confidence of weather forecasters announcing sun. There was a hush then, not dramatic but dense, and I could feel everyone calculating whether I was exaggerating for effect or pulling a thread that would unravel the whole tablecloth. And I spared them the arithmetic by turning to David with the softest smile I could summon and saying that it must have been a relief not to juggle bills while studying case law, because the mind can do only so much heavy lifting when the stomach is busy counting down. And he flushed in a way I had not seen since childhood, then tried to laugh, then glanced at our parents for the script, only the script had slipped under the couch with the dust. Aunt Linda cleared her throat and asked my mother if that was true, not in a harsh way, but with that accountant's curiosity that doubles as a moral compass. And my mother said something about family investments and long-term plans and doing what is best for everyone, at which point I set down my fork and said that everyone is a word that should be put in writing, because when it is not written it tends to shrink to fit the favorite child, and the aunts looked at one another with a kind of sympathy that is half for me and half for a version of themselves, while my father announced that this conversation was inappropriate at a celebratory meal, and I agreed brightly, adding that the celebration seemed rather lopsided given that one kid received tuition and the other received chores and encouragement to be realistic. I did not shout and I did not cry. I simply took the folder from my tote and laid the acceptance letter face down beside my plate like a card in a game no one realized we were playing. And I said that I would be leaving in late summer to attend a program that had decided I was worth the line items, and that I would be covering my expenses myself because independence is cheaper than debt when the interest rate on family help includes obedience and silence, and I watched the shock register around the table not as outrage but as resorting, as if the seating chart had suddenly been corrected. My mother's smile vanished as cleanly as a lamp switched off, and she leaned toward me with a softness that made the hairs on my arms rise, asking whether I intended to embarrass them in front of kin after everything they had sacrificed. And I told her I intended only to stop pretending that a closed door is a hallway, and that truth told calmly is not cruelty, it is a mirror, which is why so many people hate it. For dessert I poured coffee and passed plates as if nothing had shifted, yet the air felt newly weighted, and when the relatives finally left with their casseroles and their murmured blessings, my mother followed me into the kitchen and pressed me against the sink with a smile that did not touch her eyes, whispering that I had ruined the family's reputation and that I would regret turning my brother's achievements into a spectacle. And I dried my hands and told her that achievements do not become spectacles unless the audience is forced to sit in the dark, and that I had only turned on a small light. Her lips barely moved when she said that if I walked out on them after all they had done, then I should not expect a key, a couch, or $1 ever again, and I said that sounded wonderfully consistent, then lifted my tote, felt the letter steady against my hip, and stepped past her with a careful nod while realizing that my second revenge, public, quiet, irreversible, had landed exactly where it was supposed to, leaving behind a silence that was not peace, but preparation, and in that silence I heard the click of a door in my head that had finally, mercifully, locked. The week after the family gathering unfolded with that strange combination of politeness and surveillance that families use when they are trying to restore an old script while also checking whether the actors still remember their lines. So my mother left shore lists with cheerful exclamation points, and my father made a point of complimenting the coffee I brewed before dawn as if gratitude were a leash, and David treated the living room like a courtroom where he could rehearse arguments that all ended with him as the obvious winner. Yet beneath that choreography I felt the floor tilt in my favor because information, not affection, was finally the currency I kept to myself. I began to measure my days in deposits rather than hours, telling the cafe manager I would take every early shift and telling the contractor I could process late-night batches if the pay hit my new account on Fridays. And I funneled the quiet trickle of money toward 3 goals that felt like doors aligned in a row: first month's rent for a small apartment that had creaky floors and a window that could hold a plant, a used laptop that didn't outrun my fingers, and a reserve for tuition and books. That I refused to label an emergency fund because my future was not an emergency, it was a plan. While at home, I let my mother's stories about David's upcoming graduation trip roll over me like bath steam, warm and temporary. Because the truth is that steam rises and disappears while tile stays cool no matter how long you soak. The night David announced that the ceremony would be a family affair and that he expected me to stand near the aisle with my phone ready for his walk across the stage, I smiled like a friendly stranger in an elevator and asked what time the procession began. Not because I intended to attend, but because details have a way of turning into lever arms when you need to lift something heavy, and while he described the auditorium with the predictable sanctimony of someone who assumes the map belongs to him, I set a quiet alarm in my calendar that would not take me to his seat, but would instead remind me to press send on an email I had been polishing for days. On the morning of his ceremony, my mother left a garment bag on my bed with a note that read, "Dark dress, nothing flashy," which made me laugh in the kind of way that happens without sound. And I carried the bag back to her room with a sweetness that made her blink before she could brace, telling her I appreciated the thought, but would be heading into the city for a meeting. And when she said that family comes first, I said that my boss expected me to take the opportunities one had earned, and that sometimes family comes second to the rent that keeps a roof above the bed where one sleeps after the applause fades, and she pressed her lips together as if holding water. At the exact minute the orchestra tuned their instruments and the first rows stood to shuffle their feet into place, I stepped into the office of a manager whose handshake felt like the beginning of a contract I had written in my head for years. And I listened carefully as she described the role that would start in late summer with flexible hours during fall semester, and I asked all the questions people ask when they already know the answer, then signed the offer with a pen that kept slipping. Because my palm was slick with the relief of someone who has been waiting to stop balancing on one foot, and by the time David's name was called, I was posing beside a plain lobby wall with the paper angled in my hand, and my smile just short of giddy. The message I sent held no confetti and no grandstanding, only a single carefully lit photo attached to a sentence I knew would land where it hurt and where it healed at the same time. Because I wrote that I would be unable to attend the ceremony since I was signing the offer for a job I secured without help, which would fund my move and my classes and my life. And that I wished him success, because success obtained without accountability tends to crumble under its own expensive shoes, and then I turned off my phone and rode the bus home with the offer letter zipped into my bag like a warm animal that needed quiet. When I walked through the door that evening, the kitchen smelled like reheated celebration, and my mother was setting out leftover cake with that deliberate clatter that turns plates into punctuation. And before I could take off my shoes, my father demanded to know whether I understood what I had done, because in his telling I had humiliated my brother and insulted the family and behaved as if my own achievements were a rebuke rather than a contribution. And I said that my achievements were exactly that, mine, and that a contribution offered under threat of guilt is not generosity, but a transaction with a bad interest rate, and he stared at me as if I had spoken a language he refused to learn. Later, when David finally appeared, flushed with attention and oddly tired around the eyes, he called me selfish with the weary authority of someone who has never had to wonder whether the bill will be paid, and I told him that selfishness would have been showing up, clapping and pretending that the world made sense when it didn't, because the truth is that families can survive honesty, but they wilt under counterfeit praise, and he opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't arrange themselves fast enough to outrun the picture of my signed offer glowing on his screen. My third revenge, though it looked like absence, was in fact a presence that could not be dismissed, because while they were arranging centerpieces and congratulatory toasts, I had placed a new fulcrum beneath my own life. And it shifted the weight so completely that when my mother whispered that I had chosen a paycheck over my blood, I said I had chosen a path over a leash, and that if they wanted to talk about loyalty, we could start with the years they spent underwriting one child's dreams, while advising the other to be realistic, and for once nobody corrected my tone. I went in my room and unhooked the garment bag that had never been mine, replaced it with a thrift store blazer that would be, and drafted a short message to the landlord who had promised me the apartment if I could transfer the deposit by the end of the week. And as I hovered over the final confirmation, I heard my mother's voice in the hallway telling my father that if I left now we should consider the door permanently closed, which made me laugh under my breath because the door in question had never stayed open unless it led to someone else's party, and I pressed confirm with a steadiness that felt like the opposite of approval-seeking, then stepped back into the kitchen where the cake sweated under plastic wrap. And when my father said that family takes care of family, I answered that I had learned that from them, only I had also learned the unspoken footnote, which is that family seems to shrink to the size of the person being celebrated. And in that moment the room held its breath. Long enough for me to realize that the next knock I would hear would not be on my bedroom door, but on the door of an apartment with my name on the lease, and I was not at all sure who would be standing on the other side. The years that followed did not unfold like a movie montage with quick cuts of smiling independence and triumphant soundtracks, but rather like a long, uneven road where every milestone had to be built plank by plank, from savings accounts, side hustles, late-night study sessions, and the kind of stubbornness that tastes like rust in your mouth because it never goes away no matter how much water you drink. I learned quickly that freedom is not glamorous, but practical. It is the grocery list you can afford without asking, the rent check you sign without shame, the degree you finish without anyone claiming the credit, and the peace of waking up in a place where nobody monitors your comings and goings or counts your hours as though they are coins in their own purse. When I graduated, there was no cheering family in the front row, no bouquet of flowers waiting in the lobby, no photograph with proud parents standing beside me. There was only me, in a rented gown, smiling at a stranger's camera, and when I walked out of the auditorium holding the diploma that had taken every ounce of grit I possessed, I realized that the absence of applause had not diminished the value of the paper in my hands. If anything, it had carved the achievement deeper into me, because every line of that diploma had been paid for in my own sweat, my own discipline, my own refusal to give in to the narrative that I was somehow less deserving. Meanwhile, my parents' world, which had once looked so solid, began to show cracks. David finished law school with an expensive degree that gleamed like polished brass, but came attached to a job market that had grown crowded and merciless, and for the first time in his life, he found himself unable to turn confidence into cash. The jobs he chased evaporated into unpaid internships, short-term contracts, or positions that promised prestige but delivered little in the way of stability. He carried himself with the same entitled charm, but beneath it his debt grew heavier, and when my parents tried to soften the weight with yet more money, they discovered that their reserves had thinned. Because retirement accounts do not stretch indefinitely when drained for one child's future. It was around this time that my phone began to ring with numbers I knew by heart but had ignored for months at a stretch. The voicemails came layered with guilt and urgency, my father's voice explaining that the roof needed repairs and the insurance payout had been delayed, my mother's voice trembling as she described medical bills that seemed to pile up faster than they could manage, and always, woven beneath the words, the expectation that I would return not just physically but financially, as though the past could be washed away if I simply wrote a check with my own name on it. I listened to each message with a stillness that surprised me, because a part of me had expected to feel triumph at their desperation, yet what I felt instead was something more complicated, something closer to confirmation that the cycle had turned, and that I now held the decision they once held so casually when they chose him over me. One evening, after ignoring yet another call, I finally answered, and my mother's voice cracked with relief as she rushed into explanations about the house and the bills and David's struggles, and she ended with a plea so simple it almost sounded childlike. "We just need a little help, sweetheart, just this once." I let the silence stretch until she began to ask if I was still there, and then I told her clearly, without cruelty, but also without hesitation, that they had already spent my share of family loyalty on David, and that what they were asking for was not help but repayment, and repayment requires a debt, and the debt was never mine to begin with. The line went quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again her tone had hardened into that familiar mix of shame and accusation, as if she could erase the truth by recasting it as betrayal, but I no longer felt the sting of her disapproval. Instead, I felt the strange calm of someone who has finally stopped waiting for fairness from people who never practiced it. I ended the call politely, almost gently, and then I placed my phone face down on the table and sat there with the weight of my decision pressing into me like a stone that both anchors and steadies. In the years since, I have built a life that is not dazzling but solid, a career that pays well enough to silence the constant hum of fear, friendships that function like chosen family, a home that is mine alone. Yet sometimes, when I hear about David stumbling from one job to the next, or about my parents juggling the arithmetic of aging with bills that do not shrink, I wonder whether my refusal to help is justice or vengeance, whether it is strength or stubbornness, and whether the line between those pairs of words was always blurrier than I wanted to admit. I tell myself that I do not owe them, that what they taught me was not how to love, but how to ration loyalty, and that their lesson has served me well even if it left scars I cannot fully name. Still, late at night, when the house is quiet and I stand at the window staring out at the dark, I sometimes hear my father's phrase echoing in my head, "Family takes care of family," and I feel the tug of a question I cannot dismiss. If blood is supposed to be thicker than water, then why does it feel like water, clear and flowing and unburdened, is the only thing that never stains when it spills? The truth is that I do not know whether I will ever forgive them, or whether forgiveness even matters at this point. But what I do know is that the distance I placed between us was not born of cruelty but of survival, and that every dollar I refused to send back was less about punishing them and more about preserving the version of myself I had fought so hard to become. And maybe that is the real revenge, not the withholding of money or affection, but the fact that I learned to live without needing their approval, their applause, or their promises, and that I am strong enough to let the ending remain unfinished, leaving them and me. And anyone who hears this story, suspended in the question of whether reconciliation is possible or whether some doors, once closed, are better left locked forever.